In the 14th century, in a stone tower above a city whose name has been largely forgotten, a man sealed himself inside his own work. He had built the chamber himself. Thick walls, a single narrow window that let in enough light to work by and not enough to be seen. A furnace at the center that burned day and night. He was transmuting something. Lead into gold, according to the official story. But those who understood what alchemy actually was knew that the substance being transformed inside the vessel was not the lead in the crucible. It was him. The vessel was sealed. That was the point. The Vas Bene Clausum, the well-sealed vessel, was not optional equipment. The transformation required containment. Nothing in, nothing out. A closed system where the heat could build, where the material could be broken down and rebuilt into something that the open air would have dissolved before it had the chance to form. And it worked. That is the part of this story that matters. The isolation worked. The sealed vessel did exactly what it was designed to do. You recognize this person, not because you know anything about alchemy, because you built this exact structure. Not in stone, not with a furnace at the center, but in the only material you had available, which was yourself. You built the fortress because the open air was not safe for what you were trying to become, and the work inside it was real. The transformation was genuine. What you produced in the sealed chamber of your own making was not fool's gold. But here is the question this video is about. A question the alchemist in that tower eventually had to face. What happens when the work is complete and the vessel never opens? Carl Jung spent 30 years studying alchemical texts, not because he was interested in medieval chemistry, but because he understood that the alchemists were not writing about lead and gold. They were writing about something much harder to transmute. The psyche, the soul, the raw material of a human being who has been damaged by the conditions of their formation. The alchemical process begins with what the alchemists called the prima materia, the original substance. In psychological terms, this is whatever you were given before you had any choice in the matter. The household you were born into, the attachment patterns written into you before you had language, the specific character of the neglect or the pressure or the loss that shaped the architecture of your nervous system. Before you could articulate what was happening to you, the prima materia is always base, not as an insult, but as a description. The process begins with something unrefined, uncontrolled, reactive, prone to volatility, prone to being hurt. The first work of alchemy is nigredo, the blackening, the breaking down of the original substance into something that can be rebuilt. In psychological terms, this is the suffering you did not choose, the losses that dismantled the self you thought you were, the experiences that proved the world was not safe, and that you would have to become someone capable of surviving it. That is the nigredo. It happens to you. You do not initiate it. What follows the nigredo is the part you actually built, the part that deserves recognition. You learned to seal yourself, not as a strategic decision made in a boardroom, but as an adaptive response to the specific conditions of your formation. You learned that your needs, when expressed openly, were not met, or were punished, or were met with a particular quality of absence that was worse than refusal. And so, you closed the vessel. You created a self-contained system. You stopped depending on the external environment for the things the external environment had demonstrated it could not reliably provide. This was not weakness dressed up as strength. This was genuine capability development. The person who no longer requires external validation to function has built something real. The person who can sit in their own company without desperation has mastered something most people never learn. The person who does not beg for what they need because they have learned to generate it internally has done genuine work on the material of themselves. The vessel sealed. The transformation began. And for a long time, it produced exactly what it was supposed to produce. But there is a stage that comes after the sealing. And most people who built the fortress the way you built it never receive any instruction about what comes next. We will get to that, because what comes next is the thing you have been avoiding for longer than you know. The alchemical stage, called coagulation, is the stage of fixing. The substance that was liquid and volatile becomes solid and stable. In practical alchemy, this is the crystallization phase, the point at which the transformed material takes on a permanent structure that will hold its form under pressure. Psychologically, it is the point at which what you built stops being a process and starts being an identity. There is a specific moment in the development of the self-sufficient person when the adaptation shifts from adaptive to structural, when the sealed vessel stops being a tool you use and starts being the thing you are. You no longer deploy the fortress when circumstances require it. You live inside it continuously. The distinction between the protection and the person begins to erode. Jung recognized this pattern precisely. He called it inflation of the persona. The persona, which is the mask we present to the world, a necessary and genuinely useful psychological structure, begins to fuse with the face beneath it. The distance between the performance and the performer collapses. And once the persona has coagulated in this way, it is no longer flexible. It no longer serves you. You serve it. This is the moment the coagulatio becomes a problem. The substance has crystallized. The walls have set. And the vessel, which was always meant to be a container for a process and not a permanent residence, has become exactly that. A permanent residence. A place you live now. A structure you defend, not because the work inside requires defending, but because the structure itself has become the point. Watch what this looks like in the specific texture of a day. Someone offers help, and you decline it before you have evaluated whether the help would have been useful. Someone expresses care, and your body registers it as a threat assessment before your mind has time to process it as care. Someone wants to know you more deeply, and you experience the desire as a kind of pressure, an intrusion, something to be managed. Not because the person is untrustworthy, because the vessel's primary function, the function that has now become structural, is to prevent anything from entering. The gold is real. That is what makes this difficult to name. The transformation that happened inside the sealed vessel produced something genuine. The self-sufficiency is not performance. The capability is real. The hard-won peace of not requiring external approval to function is a genuine achievement of psychological development. But the vessel that produced it has coagulated, and coagulated vessels do not breathe. There is an image from alchemical tradition that appears across every culture that developed an alchemical practice. The ancient Egyptians had it. The Greeks encoded it. The medieval European texts carry it through to the Renaissance. A snake eating its own tail. forming a perfect circle, self-contained, complete, going nowhere. The Ouroboros. The image has been interpreted as a symbol of eternity, of cycles, of self-renewal. And it can mean all of those things. But in alchemical psychology, it carries a more precise meaning. It is the image of a system that has become entirely self-referential, a closed loop. All input consumed internally, all output feeding back into the same system. No exchange with anything outside the circumference of the circle. In thermodynamics, this is called a closed system. A closed system cannot evolve. It can redistribute the energy it already contains. It can change its internal configuration, but it cannot gain anything new from its environment, and it cannot offer anything irreversible to the world outside it. In a closed system, entropy eventually wins. The internal energy degrades. The temperature equalizes. The differentiation collapses. What was once alive and producing becomes, by the second law, still. You can see the Ouroboros in the life of the person whose solitary gold has coagulated into a closed loop. The relationships that are permitted are the ones that ask nothing. The conversations that are permitted are the ones that can be controlled. The emotional territory that is inhabited is the territory that can be managed without risk of genuine exposure. You see the world through the narrow window in the tower with perfect clarity. You understand other people. You read situations accurately. You have real insight, but you see it all from behind glass, perfectly visible, completely untouchable. Did Jung himself inhabit this fortress? This is worth knowing, because what happened to him tells you something about what the second stage of the work requires. Between 1913 and 1920, after his break with Freud, Jung descended into what he himself described as a period of creative illness. He sealed himself into his own inner world. He built a stone tower at Bollingen with his own hands, a literal fortress on the water, and retreated there repeatedly over decades. He allowed almost nothing in from the world outside. He was exploring the unconscious in a way that required the sealed vessel to hold. But Jung understood something the person in your position may not yet have been told. The sealed vessel is the container for the first work. It is not the container for the second work. And the second work is the one that determines whether what you built was individuation or isolation, with better justification. What is the second work? We are getting there. But first, you need to hear the thing you came here hoping this video would say, and the thing you also came here hoping it would not say. You have described this to yourself as peace, the absence of turbulence, the low level of disappointment, the freedom from the specific grief of wanting things from people who cannot give them to you. You have looked at the calm interior of the sealed vessel, and you have correctly identified that it is calmer in here than it was before, and you have named that calm as peace, as achievement, as evidence that the work succeeded. Here is what you have not yet looked at directly. The calm is real. The quieter quality of your nervous system compared to where you started is real. But there is a difference between peace and the absence of data. And what you are living in is not primarily peace. It is primarily the absence of data. You have not transcended your need for others. You have disabled the sensor that reports it. You have not overcome the fear of loss. You have simply arranged your environment so that there is nothing present whose loss would register as unbearable. Numbness is not the same as stillness. Stillness is the quality of a person who is fully present, fully capable of being moved, and at rest. Numbness is the quality of a closed system that has lowered its own temperature until the disruptions no longer penetrate the walls. Both feel quiet from the inside. One of them is alive, and you are sophisticated enough to know which one this is. Here is the question Jung would ask you, not gently, with the specific precision of a man who had himself sat in the sealed vessel and felt its comfort and understood its cost. Is the gold still in process? Or has it coagulated past the point of use? Because there is a specific diagnostic for this. The gold that is genuine and living feels like something you can offer. You can bring it into contact with another person, or a purpose, or an experience, and it produces something. The gold that has coagulated past use feels like something you are protecting, not offering. Protecting. You are guarding the treasure from a contamination that has not threatened it in years. And the act of guarding has become the point. Ask yourself honestly, when did you last allow something to move you without immediately analyzing the movement? When did you last let something matter without immediately calculating its probability of becoming a source of pain? When did you last permit another human being to know something real about you that you could not control their response to? If the answer is genuinely recent, this chapter is not about you. But if the answer requires effort to locate, if the examples that come to mind feel distant, if a version of your mind has already begun constructing the argument that this question does not apply because your particular self-sufficiency is more sophisticated than the one being described, then you have just watched your own sealed vessel respond to a potential opening by tightening. That tightening is not wisdom. It is coagulatio, defending itself. The old alchemical literature was clear about what happens to the vessel that refuses to open. The process does not maintain itself in stasis. The sealed vessel, with no new material and no exchange with the outside environment, does not preserve the gold. It begins, slowly and almost imperceptibly, to reduce it. The heat inside the closed system equalizes. The differentiation between the transformed material and the base material from which it came collapses. You do not simply stop growing. Over time, the coagulation that protected the gold begins to calcify it. What was precious becomes inert. What was solid becomes brittle. Alchemists had a phrase for this outcome. They called it the death of the king. The moment when the achieved transformation, the gold, must itself be dissolved if something higher is to emerge. The death of the king is not a failure. In the alchemical map of the magnum opus, it is the necessary precondition for the final stage, but it requires the vessel to open. And opening the vessel is the work that the first initiation never prepared you for. The most famous phrase in alchemy has two parts: solve, dissolve, break apart. Release the structure that has formed so that the material inside it can be transformed further. Coagula, coagulate. Allow what has been dissolved to reform into something new, something that could not have existed without the dissolution that preceded it. Solve et coagula. Dissolve and coagulate. The phrase is not a description of a single operation performed once at the beginning of the work. It is the description of a recursive process. You dissolve and you coagulate, and then you dissolve again, and coagulate again, each cycle producing something that the previous structure was not capable of containing. The fortress was your first coagulatio. The work that happened inside it was real. The gold it produced was genuine. But solve et coagula does not end with the first coagulation. The phrase has two parts precisely because the alchemists understood that the transformation which created the gold must eventually be applied to the gold itself. This is the second work, and it is the one that your fortress was never designed to perform. The developmental psychologist Robert Kegan spent decades studying what he called the immunity to change, the pattern by which an intelligent, capable person who genuinely wants to grow remains structurally unable to grow in a specific direction, not from lack of will, not from lack of insight, but because below the stated desire for change, there is a hidden competing commitment, a competing goal that the system is protecting with the same energy and intelligence it brings to everything else it does. For the person in the alchemical fortress, the hidden competing commitment has a name. It is the commitment to not being dissolved. You say you want connection. You say you want to let someone in. You say you want the kind of intimacy that requires genuine exposure of the self. And you may mean all of these things completely sincerely. But below that stated desire, running on the same system that produced the fortress in the first place, is a competing commitment that has not been made conscious. The commitment to maintaining the integrity of the vessel at all costs. Because the last time the vessel was open, what entered was not good, and what escaped was everything that mattered. The second work does not ask you to destroy the fortress. That is the misunderstanding that keeps the vessel permanently sealed. You are not being asked to return to the prima materia. You are not being asked to undo the transformation. The solve of the second stage is not the negredo of the first. You are not being asked to become vulnerable in the way you were vulnerable before the first work began. You cannot become that person again. The gold is real. It will not dissolve back into lead. What the second work asks you to do is much more specific and much less catastrophic than the fear that keeps the vessel sealed. It asks you to open a small aperture in the vessel, not to remove the walls, not to invite the whole world inside, to create a deliberate, chosen, limited opening through which something new can enter, and through which something of what you have made can be offered. The alchemists called this the conjunctio, the joining, the deliberate contact of the transformed substance with something outside itself, not a merger, a contact, the gold touching something that is not gold and surviving the contact, and in surviving it, discovering something about its own nature that the sealed vessel could never have revealed. Because there are properties of the transformed material that can only be observed under contact conditions. The sealed vessel tells you what you are in isolation. The conjunctio tells you what you are in relation. And the second work is precisely the work of finding out which of those two things is more true of what you have become. The error the person leaving the fortress usually makes is trying to open it completely, as though the second initiation requires the demolition of everything the first one built, as though the appropriate response to recognizing the cage is to destroy the walls. This is not what the second work requires, and it is not what survival wisdom will allow, which is why people attempt the full opening, find it intolerable, and return to the sealed vessel with more justification than before. The attempt confirmed the fear. Of course, the world was dangerous. Of course, opening led to pain. The vessel tightens. The walls grow thicker. The window narrows. The aperture model is different. An aperture is not an absence of wall. It is a controlled opening in a wall that still exists. A camera aperture does not remove the body of the camera. It creates a precise, intentional, adjustable opening through which something specific can enter. The size of the aperture determines what enters and what remains outside. The aperture can be widened. It can be narrowed. It can be closed. The wall remains. The practical work of the second initiation begins with identifying where the aperture can be placed. Not everywhere. Not immediately. In one specific relationship, one specific context, one specific kind of exposure that you have been managing from behind glass, where you will practice a deliberate and limited increase in surface area. What does this look like concretely? You identify one person in your life whose presence you have kept at a regulated distance, not because they are unsafe, but because your system treats safety as the default evaluation. You practice allowing one genuine statement of your actual internal state to be made in their presence, not a performance of vulnerability, not a strategic disclosure designed to produce a specific response, an actual statement about something that is actually happening inside you, made without a plan for controlling their reaction to it. You will notice two things when you do this. The first is that the fear that preceded the statement is larger than the actual experience of making it. This is consistent across the research on avoidant adaptation. The anticipatory dread of exposure is calibrated to an earlier threat environment. It overestimates the current danger because it is drawing on threat data from a period when the danger was real and the consequences were severe. Your nervous system has not updated its threat map. The aperture practice updates it incrementally, replacing old data with new data that is actually current. And there is a second thing, one harder to articulate. Something inside the vessel changes when the contact is made. Not because the outside world flooded in and contaminated the gold, because the gold was exposed to a surface other than itself and survived. And in surviving, it discovered that it was more solid than the fear suggested. The vessel can breathe. The transformation can continue. The aperture does not dissolve what you built. It proves that what you built can hold. Jung did not remain in the tower at Bollingen. He returned. He brought what he found in the sealed chamber back into the world that required him to be in it. The Red Book, the record of everything that happened in the sealed vessel of his most private years, was not published in his lifetime. It was offered eventually by those who came after. But the clinical work he did in those same years, the patients he sat with while the private work was happening, that offering did not require the tower to be empty. The vessel was sealed and open at the same time in different chambers. That is the model, not the complete opening, the managed aperture, the solve that preserves the coagula. Here is what the second work reveals that the first work could not. You are not the vessel. The fortress was something you built. It was necessary. It served the work it was designed to serve. It produced real gold. All of this is true. But at some point in the long residency inside it, you began to identify with the structure rather than the substance. You began to confuse the container with the thing being contained. The vessel became the self, and everything that threatened the vessel became a threat to the self. But you are the alchemist. The alchemist is not the crucible. The alchemist is not the sealed furnace. The alchemist is not the thick wall or the narrow window or the practiced solitude. The alchemist is the one who understands the process, who can build the vessel when the vessel is needed, who can open it when the work requires opening, who is not destroyed by the opening because the alchemist exists outside the vessel as much as inside it. This is the freedom that the second work offers. Not freedom from the fortress, freedom from the belief that the fortress is what you are. The walls can remain standing. The capacity for solitude and self-sufficiency that you built inside them is real, and it is permanent, and nothing that happens in the second work will take it from you. But it becomes one of your instruments, not the boundary of your identity, one of the things you know how to do, available when you need it, not mandatory when you do not. The most dangerous person alive, as this channel has said before, is the one who needs nothing, because they cannot be controlled, because their motives are not contaminated by desperation, because their presence is not conditional on what you provide them. That is real. That capability is genuinely formidable and genuinely rare. But the free person, the one who has completed both works, is something different from dangerous. They are the one who needs nothing and still chooses to offer what they have made, not from desperation, not from loneliness, from the recognition that the gold produced in the sealed vessel was never meant to be preserved in the sealed vessel. It was meant to be brought into contact with the world that the sealed vessel was always surrounded by. The fortress was the beginning of your story, not the end of it. The second initiation has been waiting for you since the moment the first work was complete. And the fact that you are here, watching this, asking these questions about what the fortress has cost you and what it might be time to allow, that is not weakness. That is the sound of the vessel recognizing that it was always meant to breathe. The gold is real. It will survive the opening. You will survive the opening. The alchemist always does. Write in the comments, "I built the vessel." And if you are willing, tell me, what has the sealed chamber kept you from that part of you has always known it was meant for?